The morning sun had barely risen when the large house began to come alive. The kitchen lights were already on, and the sound of dishes could be heard from inside. In the middle of all the activity was a young woman who worked quietly from one room to another. Every day, she woke up before everyone else and started her duties long before the family opened their eyes. She had worked in the mansion for almost 3 years. The house was one of the biggest in the city, owned by a wealthy businessman known for his success and influence. Expensive cars filled the driveway. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings. Everything inside looked perfect. Yet the people who visited the house rarely noticed the workers who kept everything running smoothly. Among them was the young maid. She was known for being polite, hardworking, and dependable. If something needed to be done, she did it without complaint. She never argued, never demanded attention, and never spoke more than necessary. To most people, she was simply part of the background. Many guests couldn't even remember her face. As she cleaned the living room that morning, she glanced toward the grand piano standing near the large windows. The piano was beautiful. Its polished black surface reflected the sunlight perfectly. It was one of the most expensive items in the house. The owner often told guests how much it had cost him, but very few people actually played it. Most of the time, it sat there untouched. The young maid paused for only a moment before returning to work. She knew she wasn't supposed to touch it. Still, every time she passed by, her eyes were drawn toward it. There was something about a piano that always made her stop and remember. Remember another life. A life that felt very far away now. Years earlier, things had been very different. When she was a child, music had been her whole world. Her family was not rich, but they were happy. Her father worked long hours, and her mother did whatever she could to support the family. They didn't have much money, but they always encouraged her dreams. One day, a music teacher heard her playing an old piano at a community center. The teacher immediately recognized her talent. From that moment, everything changed. She began taking lessons. She practiced every day. While other children spent hours playing outside, she spent countless hours learning scales, reading music, and improving her skills. She loved every second of it. The piano wasn't just an instrument to her. It was a place where she felt completely free. Whenever she sat in front of the keys, the world around her disappeared. Music became her way of expressing emotions she couldn't put into words. As the years passed, her talent continued to grow. Teachers praised her. Audience members admired her performances. People often said she had a bright future ahead. Some even believed she could become a professional pianist one day. For a while, it seemed like that dream might actually come true. Then life changed. Her father suddenly became ill. The medical bills started growing. The family savings quickly disappeared. Soon, every penny was needed for basic necessities. Music lessons became impossible to afford. At first, she tried to continue practicing whenever she could. But problems kept increasing. Eventually, she had to make a difficult choice. Her family needed help. Dreams would have to wait. She left her studies and started working. At first, she believed it would only be temporary. A few months, maybe a year. Then she would return to music. But months turned into years, and the piano slowly became a distant memory. Back in the present, she finished cleaning the living room and moved toward the dining area. The day was busy as usual. Several guests were expected that weekend. The owner was preparing for an important gathering. Everyone in the house had extra work to do. As she polished the large dining table, she overheard two workers talking. "Did you hear?" one asked. "The boss is inviting some very important people." The other nodded. "I heard musicians might be coming too." She quietly continued working. The word musicians immediately caught her attention. For a brief moment, old memories returned. Concert halls, practice rooms, standing ovations. Then she pushed the thoughts away. Those days belonged to the past. Or at least that was what she kept telling herself. Later that evening, after everyone had finished dinner, the house became quiet. Most of the staff returned to their rooms. The owner had gone out for a meeting. The young maid finished washing the last dishes and slowly walked through the empty hallway. As she passed the living room, she noticed something unusual. The grand piano was uncovered. Normally, it remained protected beneath a large cloth. Tonight, however, it stood completely exposed. Moonlight streamed through the windows and reflected off its smooth surface. She looked around carefully. No one was nearby. The room was silent. For several seconds, she simply stared. Her heart beat faster. A familiar feeling began rising inside her. The feeling she hadn't experienced in years. She stepped closer, then closer, until she finally stood beside the piano. Her fingers lightly touched the edge. The smooth wood felt familiar, almost like greeting an old friend. She sat down carefully on the piano bench. For a moment she hesitated. Then she placed her hands above the keys. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, from emotion. Years had passed since she had last played on a piano like this. She closed her eyes and pressed the first key. A single note echoed through the room. Clear, beautiful, powerful. She played another note, then another. Soon, a gentle melody began to fill the empty mansion. The music was soft and emotional. Every note carried memories. Memories of dreams. Memories of sacrifice. Memories of everything she had lost. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The music flowed naturally from her hands. It was as though no time had passed at all. Minutes slipped by. She became completely lost in the melody. Then suddenly, a voice interrupted her. "What are you doing?" She froze instantly. Her hands stopped moving. The music disappeared. Her heart sank. Slowly, she turned around. One of the house supervisors stood in the doorway. The woman looked shocked. The young maid quickly stood up. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean any harm." The supervisor stared at her for a moment. Then something unexpected happened. "You play quite well," she said. The young maid lowered her eyes. "It has been a long time." The supervisor continued looking at her. "You should get back to your room before someone sees you." Relieved, she nodded. "Thank you." Without another word, she quietly left the room. But neither of them noticed someone standing farther down the hallway. Someone who had heard part of the performance. Someone who had stopped walking the moment the music began. The wealthy owner of the mansion. He had returned home earlier than expected. From where he stood, he couldn't fully see the pianist. But he had heard enough to know the music was extraordinary. As he watched the young maid disappear down the hallway, curiosity filled his mind. Who was she? And how could a maid play like that? He didn't know it yet, but the answer would soon surprise everyone in the house. And before long, one simple challenge would change both of their lives forever. The next morning, the mansion was busier than usual. Workers moved quickly from room to room. Fresh flowers were being arranged. Tables were being prepared. The kitchen staff worked non-stop as they planned meals for the important guests arriving the following evening. The young maid tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept returning to the night before. She could still remember the sound of the piano. For the first time in years, she had allowed herself to play freely. It had felt wonderful, but now she worried. What if someone complained? What if the owner thought she had crossed a line? She had been careful during her years of employment. She never wanted trouble. As she folded freshly washed towels, another worker entered the laundry room. "Did you hear?" the woman asked. "Hear what?" "The boss is personally supervising tomorrow's dinner." The maid nodded. That wasn't unusual. The businessman always wanted everything perfect when important guests visited. The worker lowered her voice. And apparently he was asking questions about the staff this morning. The maid looked up. "Questions?" "Yes, mostly normal things. But he specifically asked about you." The towel slipped slightly from her hands. "Me?" The woman nodded. "I thought it was strange too." A feeling of nervousness settled inside her stomach. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Several times she found herself wondering why the owner would suddenly ask about her. They rarely spoke. In fact, during her 3 years in the mansion, he had barely said more than a few words to her. By lunchtime, she had almost convinced herself not to worry. Then one of the supervisors approached her. The boss would like to speak with you. Her heart immediately began racing. Now? Yes. She wiped her hands and followed the supervisor through the mansion. The walk felt much longer than usual. Finally, they reached the owner's office. The large wooden doors stood open. Inside, the businessman sat behind an enormous desk covered with papers. He looked up as she entered. The supervisor quietly left them alone. For a moment neither spoke. Then he gestured toward a chair. You may sit. She hesitated before carefully sitting down. The businessman studied her for several seconds. You've worked here for 3 years, correct? Yes, sir. And before that? I worked different jobs. He nodded slowly. Then he asked the question she had been dreading. Where did you learn to play the piano? Her heart nearly stopped. For a moment she didn't know what to say. So he had heard. The silence stretched between them. Finally she answered honestly. I learned when I was younger. Professional lessons? Yes, sir. The businessman leaned back in his chair. You never mentioned that when you applied. She lowered her eyes. It didn't seem important. He looked surprised by her answer. Not important? She gave a small smile. I was applying to be a maid. For the first time, the businessman seemed unsure what to say. He had expected a different response. Over the years, many people had tried to impress him with their talents and achievements. Yet here was someone who had hidden hers completely. How long did you study? Several years. You were very good. She remained silent. The compliment felt strange. The businessman noticed. You don't believe me? It's not that. Then what is it? She searched for the right words. That part of my life ended a long time ago. The room became quiet. The businessman suddenly felt curious. Not because of her piano skills alone. There was something different about her. Most people wanted recognition. She seemed to avoid it. After a moment he nodded. Very well. You may return to work. Relieved, she stood. Thank you, sir. As she turned toward the door, his voice stopped her. There will be music at tomorrow's dinner. She looked back. Several seconds passed. Then he simply said, That's all. She left the office confused. The following day arrived quickly. By late afternoon, luxury cars began pulling into the driveway. Important guests stepped out wearing expensive suits and elegant dresses. Laughter and conversation soon filled the mansion. The staff worked continuously. Drinks were served. Meals were prepared. Everything needed to be perfect. The young maid spent most of the evening moving between rooms, helping wherever needed. As usual, very few guests noticed her. That was fine with her. She preferred it that way. Near sunset, she entered the ballroom carrying a tray. The room looked beautiful. Crystal lights sparkled overhead. Large windows overlooked the gardens. And in the center stood the grand piano. Several guests had already gathered around it. Some were discussing music. Others shared stories about concerts they had attended. One guest claimed he had once met a famous pianist. Another insisted he could play well himself. The conversation gradually became louder. Eventually one man sat down at the piano. He played a short piece. The guests applauded politely. Then another person took a turn. And another. The performances were pleasant but simple. Meanwhile, the maid quietly continued serving drinks. Everything seemed normal. Then one guest noticed her. Excuse me, the man said suddenly. The room turned toward him. He pointed at the young maid. Does she play too? Several people laughed. The maid immediately looked uncomfortable. She hoped the conversation would end there. Unfortunately, it didn't. Another guest smiled. That's right. I heard something about that. A few heads turned toward the businessman. He remained silent. The guests became more interested. Come on, someone said. Let's hear her play. The maid shook her head politely. No, thank you. But the guests continued. Just one song. It'll be fun. We won't judge. More laughter followed. Most of them believed they were being friendly. They had no idea how uncomfortable she felt. The businessman watched quietly from across the room. Part of him wanted to stop the conversation. Another part wanted to see what would happen. One woman smiled and said, "Don't be shy." The maid tightened her grip on the tray. "I really should get back to work." But the guests weren't ready to let it go. Then one wealthy man leaned back in his chair and laughed. "Play for me." The room grew quieter. The man looked directly at her. "You're just a maid. Let's see what you've got." Several guests chuckled. Others looked uncomfortable. The words hung in the air. The young maid felt her face grow warm. She had experienced comments like that before. People often judged her by her uniform, by her job, by what they thought they knew about her. Normally she ignored such remarks, but this time felt different. Because the piano stood only a few feet away. Because music had once been her whole world. Because deep inside, she still loved it. The businessman watched her carefully. For the first time all evening, he seemed interested in her answer. The room waited. Some expected her to refuse. Others expected an embarrassing performance. Nobody expected anything extraordinary. The maid looked around the room. Dozens of eyes stared back at her. Then she looked at the piano. Memories flooded her mind. Years of practice. Years of sacrifice. Years of silence. For a moment she considered walking away. It would certainly be easier, safer, less painful. But another thought entered her mind. How much longer would she keep hiding? How many years would pass before she touched another piano? Maybe this would be her last chance. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, she suddenly felt tired of pretending that music meant nothing to her. The room remained silent. Finally, she placed the tray on a nearby table. Several guests exchanged amused smiles. They assumed she had accepted the challenge. The wealthy man who had mocked her leaned forward expectantly. The businessman watched without saying a word. Slowly, the maid walked toward the piano. Every step seemed louder than the last. The conversations stopped completely. By the time she reached the piano bench, the entire ballroom had fallen silent. She sat down carefully. Her hands rested in her lap. For several seconds she simply looked at the keys. The room waited. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then she slowly raised her hands toward the piano. And just before her fingers touched the first key, the wealthy guest smiled confidently, still expecting a simple tune. He had no idea that the next few minutes were about to leave the entire room speechless. The ballroom was completely silent. Every eye in the room was fixed on the young maid sitting at the grand piano. Some guests watched with curiosity. Others watched with amusement. A few were already expecting an awkward performance that would give everyone something to laugh about later. The wealthy man who had challenged her leaned back comfortably in his chair. A confident smile remained on his face. To him, this was nothing more than entertainment. The businessman stood near the window watching carefully. Unlike the others, he remembered the music he had heard a few nights earlier. Still, even he wasn't fully prepared for what was about to happen. The young maid took a slow breath. Her hands hovered above the keys. For a brief moment, the room disappeared. The expensive clothes, the wealthy guests, the pressure, the judgment, all of it faded away. There was only the piano, and the music waiting inside her. Then her fingers touched the keys. A single note filled the ballroom. Soft, gentle, beautiful. Then another followed. And another. The melody began quietly, almost like a whisper. Several guests exchanged glances. It sounded pleasant enough. Simple. Nothing unusual. The wealthy man smirked. This was exactly what he expected. But then something changed. The melody started to grow. The notes flowed together with perfect timing. Her fingers moved smoothly across the keyboard. Every note seemed connected to the next. The music became richer, stronger, more emotional. The conversations that had quietly started in the corners of the room suddenly stopped. People began paying closer attention. One guest slowly lowered his drink. Another turned completely toward the piano. The smile on the wealthy man's face began to fade. The maid wasn't struggling. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't searching for notes. She was completely in control. The piano seemed like an extension of her hands. The melody continued to build. Now her fingers moved faster. Not in a showy way, not to impress anyone, but with confidence. The kind of confidence that only comes from years of practice, years of dedication, years of love for music. The room grew quieter with every passing second. The businessman found himself stepping closer. His eyes never left the piano. He had attended countless concerts throughout his life. He had listened to professional musicians perform around the world. And yet there was something special about this moment. Perhaps it was because nobody had expected it. Or perhaps it was because every note felt genuine. Nothing about the performance seemed forced. The music carried real emotion, the kind that couldn't be faked. As the piece continued, memories filled the maid's mind. She remembered her childhood, the small room where she first practiced, the old piano with worn keys, the teacher who believed in her, the competitions she once entered, the dreams she had carried for years. All those memories seemed to pour directly into the music. Without realizing it, she closed her eyes. The audience disappeared completely. She wasn't performing for them anymore. She was simply playing from her heart. A guest near the front quietly shook his head in disbelief. "This can't be possible," he whispered. The woman sitting beside him nodded. She felt the same way. A few minutes earlier, everyone had seen a maid. Now they were witnessing something entirely different. The wealthy man who had mocked her shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The confidence he had shown earlier was gone. He stared at the piano with growing disbelief. Every note seemed to prove how wrong he had been. For years, he had judged people based on status, based on appearances, based on careers. And now a woman he had dismissed in seconds was demonstrating a level of talent he could never have imagined. Across the room, several guests sat frozen. No one wanted to interrupt the performance. Even the staff members standing near the doors had stopped working. They watched silently, proudly. Many of them knew the maid well. They knew how hard she worked. They knew how kind she was. But none of them had known the secret side of her. The music continued rising. The melody became more powerful. The piano seemed to come alive beneath her fingers. Each section flowed naturally into the next. The audience followed every note, every pause, every emotion. One older guest sitting near the front suddenly leaned forward. His eyes widened. Years ago, he had worked in music education before retiring. He had spent decades listening to talented performers. The moment he heard her play, he recognized something rare. This wasn't someone who had simply learned a few songs. This was someone who had been deeply trained. Someone who understood music on a much higher level. He watched her carefully. The technique, the timing, the expression, everything pointed to years of serious study. As the performance neared its peak, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the sound of glasses and plates had disappeared. There was only the piano, and the story being told through its music. Then came the final section, the most emotional part. The maid's fingers moved gracefully across the keys. The melody carried both sadness and hope, loss and determination, pain and strength. It felt like the story of her life. Many guests couldn't explain why they felt emotional, but they did. The music connected with something inside them. Some smiled. Others stared silently. One woman quietly wiped a tear from her eye, not because the music was sad, because it felt real. Every note carried honesty, and honesty has a way of reaching people. The businessman noticed the reactions around the room. People who normally talked about money, business deals, and investments were sitting in complete silence, completely captivated. That alone was remarkable. Then came the final notes. The melody slowed. The energy softened. The last few notes floated through the ballroom like a gentle goodbye. Then silence. The maid slowly lowered her hands. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Not because they disliked the performance, because they were stunned. The silence felt almost unreal. The young maid opened her eyes. For the first time since she started playing, she saw the audience again. Dozens of faces stared back at her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Her heart suddenly raced. Had she made a mistake? Had she done something wrong? Then a single pair of hands began clapping. The older guest near the front stood to his feet. He applauded with genuine admiration. A second person joined him, then another, and another. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. People stood from their chairs. Some cheered. Others shook their heads in amazement. The sound filled every corner of the room. The maid sat frozen. She hadn't expected this. For years, her music had existed only in memories. Now strangers were applauding her. The wealthy man who had challenged her remained seated for a moment. Embarrassment covered his face. Eventually, he stood as well. His applause was slower, more hesitant, but he clapped nonetheless, because there was no denying what everyone had just witnessed. The businessman walked toward the piano. The room gradually became quiet again. The guests watched closely. He stopped beside the maid. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he asked a simple question. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The room immediately became silent once more. Everyone wanted to hear the answer. The maid hesitated. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she could see the genuine curiosity in their faces. Finally, she stood, and for the first time, she began sharing the story she had kept hidden for years. A story about dreams, about sacrifice, about family, and about the life she left behind. As she prepared to speak, nobody in the ballroom realized that her story was about to touch them just as deeply as her music had. And before the night was over, one unexpected conversation would change the direction of her future forever. The applause continued for several moments. Many guests were still standing. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled as they looked toward the young maid standing beside the piano. Only a few minutes earlier, most of them had barely noticed her. Now she was the center of attention. The businessman remained near the piano. His question still hung in the air. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The room grew quiet again. Everyone waited for her answer. The young maid looked around the ballroom. Dozens of faces stared back at her. For years, she had avoided talking about her past. Not because she was ashamed, but because it hurt. Every memory reminded her of a dream she had been forced to leave behind. She took a slow breath. Then she finally spoke. "I started learning when I was a child." Her voice was calm but soft. "My family didn't have much money, but they always encouraged me." The guests listened carefully. Nobody interrupted. "When I was young, music was everything to me." A few people exchanged glances. The honesty in her voice made it clear she wasn't exaggerating. She truly loved music. "I practiced every day," she continued. "Before school, after school, sometimes late into the night." A small smile appeared on her face as old memories returned. "I loved sitting at the piano more than anything else." The older guest who had first started clapping nodded quietly. He understood that feeling. True musicians often carried that kind of passion. The maid continued, "My teachers helped me a lot. They believed I could do something special one day." Several guests leaned forward. The room remained completely silent. She wasn't telling the story dramatically. She was simply speaking from the heart. And somehow that made it even more powerful. "I entered competitions," she said. "I performed at small events. I studied as much as I could." For a brief moment, her eyes brightened. The audience could almost picture the young girl she had once been. A girl filled with hope. A girl with big dreams. Then her expression changed. The smile faded. But life doesn't always go the way we expect. The room became even quieter. Everyone sensed the difficult part of the story was coming. "My father became seriously ill." Several guests lowered their eyes. The mood shifted immediately. "The medical bills grew quickly. My family needed help." She paused for a moment. The memories were still painful. "I tried to continue studying music, but eventually we couldn't afford it." No one spoke. No one moved. The guests listened carefully. The businessman himself seemed completely focused on every word. "So I started working." Her voice remained steady. "At first, I thought it would only be temporary." A small laugh escaped her. "The plan was simple. Help my family for a little while. Then go back to music. She shook her head gently. But months became years. The reality of her words settled over the room. Many people knew how life could change plans unexpectedly. Dreams often had to compete with responsibilities. And responsibilities usually won. The maid looked toward the piano. I never stopped loving music. Her eyes remained fixed on the instrument. I just stopped believing there was a place for it in my life. Several guests seemed visibly moved. One woman quietly folded her hands together. Another guest looked thoughtful. For the first time that evening, many of them were reflecting on their own lives. The dreams they had achieved. The dreams they had lost. The sacrifices they had made. The older guest finally spoke. What was the highest level of training you received? The maid turned toward him. I studied under several teachers. The man nodded. I could tell. A few people looked at him. The retired educator smiled. You don't develop that kind of skill without serious training. The guests seemed even more impressed. Some had assumed she was simply talented. Now they realized there had once been years of dedication behind that talent. The businessman folded his arms. You never told anyone? She looked at him. No. Why not? Her answer came quickly. Because nobody asked. The room fell silent again. The simplicity of her response surprised everyone. She wasn't seeking sympathy. She wasn't seeking attention. She had simply accepted the path life had given her. One guest shook his head. That's unbelievable. Another added, you could have built a career. The maid smiled politely. Maybe. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only acceptance. The older guest stepped closer. Have you played publicly since leaving your studies? She shook her head. Not really. The man looked genuinely surprised. You mean tonight was your first performance in years? Yes. The reaction around the room was immediate. Several guests gasped. Others looked stunned. One woman covered her mouth. That's impossible. The retired educator smiled. Trust me, it isn't. He turned toward the businessman. You have someone very special working in this house. The businessman remained silent, but everyone could see he was thinking. Thinking about the assumptions he had made. Thinking about how close he had come to never discovering her talent. Thinking about how easily people can be overlooked. Meanwhile, near the back of the ballroom, one guest quietly held up a phone. During part of the performance, he had recorded several minutes of video. At the time, he simply wanted to capture an unexpected moment. Now he found himself watching the recording again. The music sounded just as beautiful as it had a few minutes earlier. Without really thinking about it, he sent the video to a few friends. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket. He had no idea how important that simple decision would become. The conversation in the ballroom continued. Guests gathered around the maid. For the first time, they weren't asking about her work. They were asking about her music, her training, her experiences, her dreams. Questions came from every direction. What was your favorite piece to play? Do you still practice? Would you ever perform again? The attention felt overwhelming. She wasn't used to being noticed. For years she had blended into the background. Now everyone wanted to know her story. The businessman finally raised a hand. The room quieted. He looked directly at the maid. Would you be willing to play another piece? A few guests immediately smiled. Others nodded eagerly. The maid seemed surprised. You want me to play again? Yes. The businessman glanced around the room. I think everyone would enjoy that. The guests quickly agreed. Several voices echoed through the ballroom. Absolutely. Please do. We'd love to hear more. For a moment she hesitated. Then she looked at the piano. A feeling she hadn't experienced in years slowly returned. Excitement. Not fear. Not pressure. Excitement. She nodded gently. I can play one more. The room erupted into applause. She returned to the piano bench. This time everything felt different. Earlier she had been proving nothing. Now she simply wanted to share the music she loved. As her fingers touched the keys once more, the guests settled into their seats. The second performance felt warmer, more personal. The nervousness was gone, and the audience seemed even more connected. By the time she finished, many people were smiling. A few stood to applaud again. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The evening was no longer about business deals or social status. It had become about something much simpler: talent, passion, and the reminder that every person has a story. As the gathering slowly continued, guests kept talking about the performance. Many said it was the highlight of the entire evening. Others couldn't stop discussing how unexpected it had been. The businessman watched everything quietly, and for the first time in many years, he found himself thinking about something other than business. He was thinking about potential, about opportunities, about how easily talent can remain hidden when nobody takes the time to look. Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, the short video that had been recorded during the performance was beginning to spread from one phone to another. Only a few people had seen it so far, but that number was growing. And by the time morning arrived, the young maid's life would begin changing in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning felt like any other morning at first. The young maid woke up early, put on her work uniform, and started her daily routine. She swept hallways, arranged furniture, and helped prepare breakfast for the household. After everything that had happened the previous evening, she expected life to return to normal. She assumed the guests had gone home. She assumed people would eventually forget the performance. Most importantly, she assumed she would simply continue doing her job as she always had. But she was wrong. Very wrong. Around mid-morning, she noticed something unusual. The staff members kept looking at their phones. Some appeared excited. Others seemed confused. A few glanced at her and quickly looked away. At first she didn't think much of it. Then one of the kitchen workers hurried toward her. "You need to see this." The maid looked surprised. "See what?" The worker handed over a phone. A video was playing. The moment she saw the screen, her eyes widened. It was her, sitting at the piano, playing in the ballroom. Someone had recorded the performance. The maid stared in shock. "Where did this come from?" "I'm not sure," the worker replied. "But everyone is sharing it." She looked closer. Thousands of people had already watched the video. Comments continued appearing every few seconds. Many viewers praised her performance. Others wanted to know who she was. Some couldn't believe the story behind the video. The maid handed the phone back slowly. This didn't feel real. Only yesterday she had been completely unknown. Now strangers across the internet were discussing her music. She didn't know whether to feel excited or nervous. Maybe both. Throughout the day, the attention continued growing. More messages arrived. More people shared the video. By afternoon, local community pages had posted it. Several music lovers reposted it as well. The performance seemed to be reaching new audiences every hour. Meanwhile, inside his office, the businessman was receiving calls. Several of his friends wanted to discuss the performance. Some asked questions about the maid. Others wanted to know if she had any professional background. One caller even joked, "You may have hired the most talented maid in the city." The businessman laughed politely, but deep down he knew there was truth in those words. Later that afternoon, he asked to speak with her. When she entered the office, she immediately felt nervous. The businessman stood near the window holding a tablet. He turned toward her. "Have you seen the video?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." "What do you think about it?" She smiled awkwardly. "I don't really know what to think." The businessman understood. The entire situation had happened so quickly. One evening she was cleaning rooms. The next, people were talking about her talent online. He motioned for her to sit down. She did. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he surprised her. "I owe you an apology." The maid blinked. An apology was the last thing she expected. The businessman continued. "When I first heard you play, I was surprised." He paused. "But the truth is, I had already made assumptions about you." The room grew quiet. He looked directly at her. "I saw a maid." His voice was honest. "I didn't think beyond that." The maid listened carefully. I never considered that someone working in my house might have a story like yours. His expression softened. That was my mistake. The apology felt genuine. She appreciated that. After a moment, she smiled. It's all right. The businessman shook his head. No, it isn't. He sat down across from her. People deserve to be seen for who they are, not just for their job titles. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he added something unexpected. You reminded me of that. The maid felt touched by his words, not because she needed praise, but because she could tell he truly meant them. The conversation shifted. The businessman explained that several people had reached out after seeing the video. Some were musicians. Others organized local cultural events. A few simply wanted to meet her. The maid listened carefully. Everything sounded overwhelming. Then he handed her a printed letter. She looked down. The letter came from a community arts organization. They were organizing a special music event a few weeks later, and they wanted her to perform. The maid stared at the page. Her hands trembled slightly. You must be joking. I'm not. She looked up. They want me to perform? Yes. But I haven't performed publicly in years. The businessman smiled. I don't think that matters. The maid looked at the invitation again. Part of her felt excited. Another part felt terrified. Performing in front of dinner guests was one thing. Standing on a real stage was something else entirely. That evening she took the letter home. For hours she sat quietly thinking. The opportunity felt unreal. Years earlier she had dreamed about moments like this. Then life had taken her in a completely different direction. Now somehow the dream was returning. The question was whether she was ready. The next few days passed quickly. The video continued spreading. People from different places began contacting the arts organization asking about her. Interest in the upcoming performance grew. Meanwhile, the maid struggled with self-doubt. Every time she considered accepting the invitation, fears appeared. What if she disappointed people? What if she wasn't as good as they expected? What if the performance at the mansion had simply been luck? The doubts felt endless. One afternoon she visited her mother. The older woman listened carefully as her daughter explained everything. The video, the invitations, the attention, the fear. When she finished speaking, her mother smiled warmly. You still love music, don't you? The maid nodded immediately. Of course. Then why are you afraid? The question caught her off guard. She thought for a moment. Because so much time has passed. Her mother gently took her hand. My child, your dream never disappeared. The maid lowered her eyes. It felt like it did. No. Her mother's voice remained calm. It was only waiting. Those words stayed with her. Waiting. Not gone. Waiting. For the first time, she began looking at the situation differently. Maybe the years away from music hadn't destroyed her dream. Maybe they had simply delayed it. A few days later, she made her decision. She accepted the invitation. The moment she informed the arts organization, preparations began immediately. Practice schedules were arranged. A piano was made available for rehearsals. Volunteers offered support. People genuinely wanted her to succeed. The businessman also offered help. He allowed her to use the mansion's grand piano whenever she needed. At first she felt uncomfortable accepting. But he insisted. You belong at that piano. The words meant more to her than he realized. Every evening after work, she practiced. Hours passed like minutes. The more she played, the more confident she became. The music that had remained hidden for years slowly returned. Not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily. With every practice session, she felt stronger, more prepared, more hopeful. One evening, after finishing a rehearsal, she sat alone in the ballroom. The mansion was quiet. Moonlight shined through the large windows. The same piano stood before her. The same piano that had changed everything. She gently touched the keys. A small smile appeared on her face. Only weeks earlier, she had believed her dream was over. Now she was preparing for a public performance. Life truly worked in strange ways. As she sat there thinking, her phone vibrated. A message had arrived from the arts organization. She opened it. The event organizers wanted to inform her that ticket requests had exceeded expectations. More people planned to attend than anyone originally anticipated. The maid stared at the message. Her heart began racing. The audience was going to be much larger than she expected. Much larger. Excitement and nervousness mixed together. The performance was now only days away. And although she didn't know it yet, that upcoming concert would become the most important moment of her life. A moment that would finally show the world who she truly was. And a moment that would prove that some dreams may be delayed, but they are never truly lost. The day of the concert finally arrived. The young maid woke up before sunrise. For several moments she simply sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window. She had waited years for a chance like this. Yet now that the day had come, it felt almost unreal. Part of her was excited. Another part was nervous. Her hands felt cold. Her stomach was filled with butterflies. No matter how much she practiced, she couldn't completely calm her nerves. This performance meant more than any performance she had ever given before. It wasn't just about music. It was about proving to herself that her dream still mattered. After getting ready, she visited her mother. The older woman was already awake. The moment she saw her daughter, she smiled. "You look nervous." The young woman laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." They both smiled. For a few minutes they sat together quietly. Then her mother reached for her hand. "You've already succeeded." The young woman looked confused. "The concert hasn't even started." Her mother shook her head. "I'm not talking about the concert." She squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "You never gave up on who you are." Those words stayed with her as she left. The drive to the concert hall felt shorter than expected. Soon she arrived at the venue. The building was beautiful. People moved in and out carrying equipment and supplies. Volunteers greeted guests at the entrance. Musicians prepared backstage. Everything felt busy and exciting. As she stepped inside, one of the event organizers hurried over. "We're so glad you're here." The organizer smiled warmly. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous." The organizer laughed. "That's completely normal." Then the organizer showed her something surprising. The audience area. Rows upon rows of seats stretched across the hall. Almost every seat was filled. People continued arriving. Families, students, music lovers, community members. Many had come specifically to hear her story, and to hear her music. The sight nearly took her breath away. Only weeks earlier she had been quietly working inside a mansion. Now hundreds of people had gathered to hear her perform. The realization felt overwhelming. Backstage she spent time preparing. She stretched her fingers, reviewed her music, took slow breaths. Other performers wished her luck. Everyone seemed supportive. Nobody treated her like an outsider. Nobody looked down on her. For the first time in a very long time, she felt like she belonged in the music world again. Meanwhile, guests continued filling the hall. Among them sat several familiar faces. The retired music educator who had heard her perform at the mansion. Some of the dinner guests from that unforgettable evening. Several staff members from the mansion. And near the center of the audience sat the businessman himself. He had arrived early, not because he felt obligated, but because he genuinely wanted to be there. Over the past few weeks, he had watched her work harder than anyone. He had seen her practice after long days of work. He had seen her fight through self-doubt. He wanted to witness the result. The concert began. Several performers took the stage first. The audience applauded each performance warmly. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The announcer stepped forward. The room gradually grew quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, "our next performer has inspired many people with her remarkable story." The audience listened carefully. Her journey reminds us that talent can be found in unexpected places, and that dreams are never truly too old to pursue. A wave of applause filled the hall. Backstage, the young woman closed her eyes briefly. Her heart pounded. This was it. The moment had arrived. The announcer smiled. "Please welcome her to the stage." The audience erupted into applause. Slowly, she walked onto the stage. The bright lights immediately filled her vision. For a brief moment, she couldn't see the audience clearly. Then her eyes adjusted. Hundreds of faces looked back at her. The applause continued. She felt nervous, but she also felt something else. Gratitude. These people had come to listen, not because of her job, not because of her background, because of her music. She sat at the piano. The applause slowly faded. Silence filled the hall. The same silence she remembered from the ballroom weeks earlier. Only now the audience was much larger. She placed her hands on the keys, took one final breath, and began to play. The first notes floated through the hall. Soft, beautiful, confident. Immediately, the audience became completely still. The music flowed naturally. Months of preparation, years of experience, a lifetime of emotions. Everything came together. As she played, she forgot about her nerves, forgot about the crowd, forgot about the pressure. Once again, there was only the music. The melody grew stronger. Every note carried meaning. Every phrase told part of her story. The audience followed her on that journey. Some smiled. Some closed their eyes. Others watched with complete attention. The retired educator sat motionless. A proud smile covered his face. The businessman watched from his seat. He remembered the first time he had heard her play. Even then he knew she was talented. But today was different. Today she seemed free, no longer hiding, no longer doubting herself. She was exactly where she belonged. The performance continued. The hall remained silent except for the piano. At one point, a young girl sitting near the front leaned toward her mother. "She's amazing." Her mother nodded. "Yes, she is." The young woman on stage never heard the conversation. But moments like that were happening throughout the audience. People weren't just listening. They were connecting with the music, feeling it, experiencing it. When the final section arrived, she poured every emotion into the performance. The years of sacrifice, the difficult choices, the lost opportunities, the hope that never fully disappeared. Everything found its way into the music. The final notes echoed across the hall. Then silence. A beautiful silence. For 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then the audience exploded into applause. People rose from their seats. The entire hall stood. The standing ovation seemed endless. Many audience members cheered. Others wiped tears from their eyes. The young woman sat frozen. She had dreamed about moments like this for years. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the reality. The applause continued, and continued, and continued. Eventually she stood. Emotion filled her face. She bowed gratefully. The audience responded with even louder applause. Backstage later, people lined up to congratulate her. Musicians praised her performance. Community leaders thanked her for sharing her story. Young students asked for advice. Everyone seemed inspired. One comment appeared again and again. "You gave us hope." That meant more to her than any compliment about talent. Because hope was exactly what her journey represented. Not perfection. Not fame. Hope. Later that evening, the businessman approached her. For a moment they simply smiled. Then he spoke. "I don't think anyone will ever forget tonight." She laughed softly. "I know I won't." He nodded. Neither would he. After a short pause, he said something important. "You taught me a valuable lesson." She looked curious. The businessman smiled. "I spent years judging people by what they did." He glanced around the hall. But talent, character, and determination don't come with labels. The young woman nodded. She understood exactly what he meant. Before leaving, he shook her hand. Not as an employer, not as a businessman, but as someone who respected her deeply. As the night came to an end, she stepped outside the concert hall. The sky above was filled with stars. The cool evening air felt refreshing. For a few moments she stood quietly, thinking, remembering, reflecting. Her journey hadn't been easy. She had lost opportunities, faced hardships, made sacrifices, but somehow those experiences had brought her here. to this moment, to this new beginning, because that was the truth. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the start of a new chapter. A chapter where she no longer hid her talent. A chapter where she embraced her dream. A chapter where she finally believed in herself again. And it all began the day someone looked at a maid and saw only a uniform, then asked her to play. What happened next reminded everyone of a simple truth. You never truly know what greatness someone carries inside. Sometimes the person the world overlooks is the very person capable of leaving everyone speechless. And sometimes all it takes is one opportunity for a hidden dream to shine.